Best-selling author Ben Macintyre is someone who knows all too well that truth is stranger than fiction. He's sold millions of copies of outrageous but true stories, which have been adapted into documentaries, TV drama, even a feature film starring Colin Firth.
Ben's latest book, Colditz, Prisoners of the Castle, tells the story of the infamous German prisoner of war camp and the band of British officers and officers from other countries who plotted desperately to escape it. Ben was one of the big drawcards of the Adelaide Writers' Week, and I'm pleased to say he joins us now from Sydney. Ben, very good morning to you.
Very good morning to you, Michael. How are you? Very
well, thank you. Now, the story of Colditz has been tilled over for decades. There have been books, there have been movies, there's even been a board game. Why did you want to have a fresh look at Colditz?
Well, the answer to that is that in spite of all the books and so on that have been written about Colditz, the real story of Colditz has really never been written before, because the mythological story is of, as you say, these brave British soldiers with moustaches, most of them, digging their way out of this huge tunnel, this huge castle. And of course that is true to a large extent. But there's another completely different story that sort of exists under the surface. And the real story of Colditz is much more bleak in some ways. It's much more interesting too. It's about class and race and sexuality and mental health, a subject that was never discussed in the post-war period. So that's the extraordinary thing about Colditz, is that it's this kind of enclosed artificial world where they kind of replicated the world they had known before, but in a much more extraordinary way.
The British class system was well and truly entrenched in Colditz. There was very much an upstairs-downstairs system, and one of the worst offenders was Douglas Bader. A lot of our viewers would know him. He was the war hero, inspired the book and the film Reach for the Sky. There he is on screen now, but he was absolutely horrible, wasn't he?
Well, he was an extraordinary combination. He was both heroic in the sense that he was extraordinarily brave, but he was also an extremely unpleasant person. And one of the proofs of that was that inside Colditz, the officers had their own servants. They had people who were brought in who were also prisoners to look after them, to cook and clean and to polish the belt buckles. So you had a kind of ruling class who were the officers, and then you had a working class who were these orderlies who were not allowed to escape. And Bader at one point banned his own Batman from being exchanged in a prisoner swap. There was a sort of brief moment when his servant could have gone home, and Douglas Bader said, "No, you're not going home, you're staying here." And that man stayed in Colditz for another 2 years.
There was an ugly tinge of racism, you pointed that out already, and it focused on the only Indian prisoner of war, a chap by the name of Briendranath Mazumdar. Tell us about him.
Well, he's extraordinary, and again, his story's never been told before. He was the only non-white officer in Colditz, and he suffered terrible racism there. He was a doctor. He'd been educated in India, born in Calcutta, and had volunteered for the British Army Medical Corps. But when he got to Colditz, he found that he was also treated as a kind of second-class citizen. He was made to cook and clean, and was also told that he was not allowed to escape. But his escape is absolutely extraordinary. I don't want to give it away for the readers out there, but his heroism is remarkable, because in a way he escaped twice. He escaped both from the Germans, but then he also escaped from this kind of strange racial, racist world that he'd found himself in.
It was a cracking escape. I can assure the viewers of that too. Hey, you also point to the fact that a lot of these male prisoners had been locked up for many years, and you tell something in your book that no other book on Colditz has told. Quite a few of these prisoners were sleeping with each other.
Yes, I mean, there was quite as much homosexuality inside Colditz as you would expect there to be. But of course, that was taboo. It was something they didn't talk about at the time. They were not encouraged to talk about it after the war, because it was still illegal for many years. And then in later life, this is one of the fascinating things, Michael, is there's a huge collection of recordings in the British Imperial War Museum, which were made in the 80s and 90s of the surviving soldiers from Colditz. And there were still quite a lot then. And then they were prepared to talk openly about these subjects, and they do discuss what actually went on inside Colditz. And it's actually very moving. It's rather poignant to hear them finally, often many of these men in old age, discussing what had really happened to them. And that is one of the aspects.
And finally, Ben, you've written some great books in the, broadly speaking, the war espionage genre. Operation Mincemeat, we mentioned that. It's been made into a great film. But also The Spy and the Traitor, one of my all-time favourites of recent years. What attracts you to this genre?
I think espionage non-fiction allows you to write, if you can get the right material, you can write a book that feels like a novel. It can be almost as exciting and thrilling as a novel, and yet every word of it is true. That's the thing I love, is when you can find the elements of a story that really pull you along, and you don't have to make a single word up. And that's almost unique to spy non-fiction.
Ben Macintyre, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. You're one of my favourite authors of recent years, so it's been quite the privilege. Thank you.
Thank you so much.